going to say hello to some of our participants and guests. Okay, who's this? That was Dallas, by the way. We got Calgary. Hi, Calgary. And Burlington. This is Burlington, Vermont, by the way. Montreal. Montreal's not home. We have us. Woohoo! We have Portland. Oh my goodness, you guys are very dark. DC, and what is going on now? That is very psychedelic going on in DC. All right, we really appreciate that, actually. That's quite nice. Ooh, Atlanta. Hi, Atlanta. You're muted, so we just do the wave. Oh, I got a wave! Woo! Even better, I love it, love it. Okay, and Buffalo. Hi, Buffalo. Are we doing mood lighting too? Hello, we see waves, we do. If you could get a little better lighting for the questions, that would be cool. Okay, Philadelphia. Wow. All right, guys. Oh, goodness. Do we get a wave? You don't have to stand up for it. You can just like, yeah. I mean, if you really want to do the full wave, that's cool too. Okay, Baltimore. Woohoo! All right. And Victoria. Hi, Victoria. Hi there. That's great. We got some waves there. Great to see you. Okay, we're moving on to Ottawa. Hi, guys. Hello. Perfect. Miami. Hi, guys. Wow, you guys look cozy. That's great. All right, guys. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Ooh, are we getting DC? In Toronto, us. Yeah, we can wave too. I would like to introduce Rick Doblin. Rick Doblin is the founder and executive director of MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. Rick's tireless work to study, document, and bring to the forefront the enormous benefits of psychedelics began in 1972 when he was 18 years old, and he's been going strong ever since. One of his latest achievements is the agreement reached between MAPS and the FDA to work closely together on phase 3 trials of MDMA-assisted therapy for patients with severe PTSD. Hi, Rick. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for doing all this work to organize this incredible event. It's so delightful to see so many psychedelic societies coming into being. What I'd like to share with you today is a little bit of an overview of what's going on around the world. But first off, I just want to say that this petition in Canada would be terrific. So far, we've raised about $40 million over the course of MAPS since 1986. We have $25 million to raise for phase 3, and we've got about 18 million of it pledged or in multi-year commitments or in hand. But we've had no federal funding for any of our psychedelic research. We have got a $2.1 million grant from all the pot smokers in Colorado for our marijuana PTSD study. But I think if we could, get support from the Canadian government, from other governments, it would be great. But I have a feeling that by the time they're willing to offer support, we're not going to need it anymore. We'll basically got it from the psychedelic community. And so in a way, now that we're getting close, I'm starting to think I don't even want government support, because it'll be nice to say this is a gift from the psychedelic community to the world, in a sense, about the values that we know and we've seen in our lives, but that we're trying to demonstrate in a more wider context. So what I'm going to do is do a bit of a PowerPoint here and then open it up for questions. Okay, so today we're basically talking about mainstreaming psychedelics and new opportunities for psychedelic research, psychedelic societies, and psychedelic clinics. And I think for all of you in these psychedelic societies to realize that you are just incredibly fortunate, such a good timing that now at this renaissance in psychedelic research, that if any of you wanted careers in this area, that it's kind of a legitimate concern. I had to go to a therapist to see if I was crazy to want to focus my life on psychedelics. And now I think there's a lot more justification and reasons for doing so. And it's not so crazy. And so the opportunities are there. I think the reasons why I think it's so important to mainstream psychedelics, Einstein has said, has become appallingly obvious that our technology has exceeded our humanity. And so what I really use this slide to illustrate is that our technology is miraculous. And we all know that through the miracle of cell phones. In a sense, we're in touch with pretty much anybody in the world that has a cell phone instantaneously almost. It's mind-boggling, but the technologies that we have not been accompanied by an evolution of our spiritual and emotional capacities. And so we're destroying the world, destroying the environment. We have nuclear weaponry that's fearsome and could destroy all sorts of things and everything. But we don't really have the emotional, spiritual maturity to handle the technology that we have. And so we really need to evolve in ways that psychedelics can be helpful for. And so I think it's essential that for humanity's survival and for our own personal growth, that we really reintegrate psychedelics into our culture, and that it has to go beyond medicine, beyond religion, into a post-prohibition world where people can explore these experiences in safe, supportive ways, but not necessarily have to have a doctor or have a clinical condition or have to be part of a religious group. So it's a fundamental human right. And I think this is why we really need to embed psychedelics within our culture, not as a counterculture, but as part of the culture. This sort of theory of social change and the importance of this came to me in a book, Robert Mueller, New Genesis, Shaping a Global Spirituality, written in '83. Robert Mueller was the Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations. And he talked about the United Nations being a place for conflicts between nations to be mediated, but that a lot of these conflicts were religious-based. And so he suggested we need a forum for the different religions to come together and realize that they're all talking more or less about the same thing with different languages, different symbol systems, different cultural backgrounds, different prophets, but that there's a commonality. And his basic thesis I summarized by saying mysticism is the antidote to fundamentalism. We see this rise of fundamentalism all over the world, and I think it's a reaction to the fact that they just can't sustain that kind of my religion is the only right one in this globalized world with the internet, with all of our cultures bumping up against each other. But the fundamentalists don't know what to do, don't know what they'll land with if they surrender these irrational fundamental views. And I think there is something there, which is mysticism and the sense of connection, and that mysticism can actually revitalize our participation in the main religions, that we can see them as vehicles rather than as ideal, each one is the best in the world, but as different kind of vehicles. So it's beyond medicine. That's the main message I'm trying to say, is that we need to go to a legalization context to embed this kind of wisdom, understanding in millions and billions of people. Terence McKenna, brother of Dennis, who you're about to hear from very shortly, talked about psychedelic society and what that would mean. And he said, what that notion means or implies to me in terms of ideology is the idea of creating a society which always lives in the light of the mystery of being. So more about mystery than certainty. What a psychedelic society would do, I think, is it would rationally solve problems, which is very interesting because we talk about psychedelics as bringing the unconscious to the surface, bringing emotions, but he's saying that once you clarify those emotions, then you can rationally solve problems. And this view about psychedelics and mysticism and personality change has been sort of verified by some recent studies. One with Catherine McLean, who showed that mystical experiences increase the personality domain of openness. And it was thought that personality doesn't really change much with life experience, but we found that psilocybin does so does MDMA, and we've published a paper about MDMA as well. Openness remains significantly higher than baseline more than a year after the session. This is the first study to demonstrate changes in personality in healthy adults after an experimentally manipulated discrete event. This is something that came out of Imperial College in England. It talks about psychedelic mystical experience of ego dissolution and political views. Ego dissolution experienced during the participants' most intense psychedelic experience positively predicted liberal political views, openness, and nature relatedness, and negatively predicted authoritarian political views. Some people have said this paper should have never been published because it'll alert opponents who want to crack down on this. I don't think so. I think we really need to do honest drug education. We should publish what we're learning. And this just supports this idea of the critical necessity, really, to move us more into a more openness, more nature-relatedness, I'd say more liberal political views, and less authoritarianism. And psychedelics can do this. And here's a sense of what's going on all over the world. We have research into depression with ketamine, ayahuasca, and psilocybin. Research into anxiety, depression related to end of life with psilocybin, MDMA, and LSD. PTSD research with MDMA and ayahuasca. I'll add marijuana there, and I consider marijuana a psychedelic, a mind-manifesting drug. We've got research into substance abuse with ibogaine, ayahuasca, psilocybin, and MDMA with some really excellent results. And there's been prior research with LSD for substance abuse that was promising. We've done research with social anxiety for MDMA and psilocybin for obsessive compulsive disorders. There's an enormous amount of psychedelic neuroscience research going on as well, but this is just the psychotherapy components that's being studied. And then it's really global, and we're really at a sense of a global renaissance. Some of the things that I think are very important that we're doing, MAPS is doing, we just published a paper about a outcome observational study in New Zealand with ibogaine, where we looked at people at baseline and every month for 12 months, and we showed, consistent with preceding studies, evidence showed significant attenuation of withdrawal, sustained reduction in drug craving use, cessation of use in some cases. These outcomes, particularly sustained reduction or cessation of opioid use, reported by 12 of 14 participants, are comparable with the success of currently accepted treatments. So within a supportive environment where there's preparation and integration work, where the clinics are in the US, I think we're going to get results that are even better than currently accepted treatments. And we also did a study in Mexico that was published, also in the American Journal of Drug and Alcohol Abuse, about opioids for treatment of ibogaine for opioid disorder. Within the limitations of an uncontrolled observational study, ibogaine appeared to have a substantive treatment effect in opioid detoxification and group statistics, and individual trajectories appear to indicate an effect of reducing drug use at 1 month, which was sustained up to 12 months in a subgroup of subjects. So it doesn't work for everybody, but it can be very helpful, and it can provide people with a new opportunity to establish a different lifestyle. We're about to start a study with MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for alcoholism with Dr. Ben Sessa at the University of Bristol. We're doing this marijuana PTSD study in Phoenix, Arizona, Scottsdale Research Institute. This was the one that's the $2.1 million grant from the state of Colorado. This is Sue Sisley is the second from the left. The rest is our team, Alia, Charlotte, and Ben. And we've got about 25 subjects. We have some problems with the Phoenix VA not referring subjects. And so we're politically trying to address that issue. And hopefully we'll succeed in the next couple of weeks to get the Phoenix VA to help out. And so there's a lot of promise, but we have President Trump and Attorney General Sessions, and they're talking about a return to law and order and an escalation of the drug war. And so is this really going to be a problem, this promising future that we're seeing, this psychedelic renaissance? And my sense of it is that it's not going to be harmful, what they're doing. And in some ways, it's going to be helpful, surprisingly. One of those main ways is that they're very interested in big business and in reducing regulations. So overall, they're going to be making it easier for drugs to move through the FDA, easier and faster. But the other main reason why I think it's going to be helpful is they're so focused on militaristic solutions in the military, and we're working with a lot of veterans with PTSD. So here's the problem. As of June 30th, 2016, more than a year ago, there was 868,000 veterans on disability for PTSD. And there's another almost 600,000 additional veterans receiving disability for anxiety, depression, and other mental disorders. This is an enormous number of people that are suffering from the psychological costs of war. And the financial costs of this are actually astounding. We have numbers, the last numbers are from 2004, from 20,000 average annual cost per veteran. And there's no modern numbers at all. We haven't been able to get them. But using the 20,000 average annual cost, it's $17 billion a year for VA disability payments just for PTSD, and $29 billion a year for all mental disorders. And you would think that given this cost, not just emotional but financial, the VA and the Department of Defense would be willing to fund our research, but that's not been the case. But they are recognizing this as a national crisis. And so here's the results that I'd like to share with you from our phase 2 studies, 107 patients in total. And so the ones that got the comparator dose, and we have which is either inactive placebo or 40 milligrams, we have 40 hours of therapy, 3 experimental sessions, day-long sessions, and 12 90-minute preparation and integration sessions. So it's a lot with a male-female co-therapist team. 23% no longer meet the criteria for PTSD after our therapy without active MDMA. When we add 2 sessions of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, it more than doubles, 55%. And these are chronic treatment-resistant PTSD patients with severe to extreme PTSD. So we're up to 55%. When we add the 3rd session, we're up to 61%. But then the question is, does this really last? Is this a brief psychedelic afterglow that they're experiencing? And, is this worth all the effort? Is something fundamentally changed, or is this just temporary? So at the 1-year follow-up, and 1 year or more, some of them are up to 3.5 years, where 2/3 of the people no longer have PTSD. So it's absolutely remarkable. And this is why the results are so compelling for such a national problem that I think that Trump and Sessions will not be able to stop it. Here's another reason that I think we're going to be more or less unstoppable. And this is because we're working with some of the leading VA-affiliated researchers who've developed non-drug psychotherapies for post-traumatic stress disorder. And so we're working with Barbara Rothbaum at Emory University in Atlanta with she's doing work now with MDMA in healthy volunteers for fear extinction. And we're going to be moving soon to sponsor a study with prolonged exposure. Just interestingly enough, we learned a week and a half ago that there's a secret study being funded by the U.S. Army into MDMA with prolonged exposure, that we weren't even supposed to find out about it, and Barbara didn't even know about it either. So the Army is funding their own research. I think the reason that they're not letting people know about it is that they were concerned that if soldiers knew that the Army was doing this research, that they might try to self-medicate with MDMA. So in my mind, that's a reason to do more research, and we wish that they would have contacted us too, because we could probably help them make it more efficient. But they did. 2 Army people did contact us a week ago Friday, and they let slip that there was this study. We're also working in Toronto with Candace Monson at Ryerson University, and also Ann Wagner. And this is cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy in dyads, couples. So what this means is one member of the couple has PTSD, but it affects the relationship. And so we're giving both members of the couple MDMA. So we're learning about couples therapy, we're educating VA-affiliated researchers, and we're helping develop a new approach for treating PTSD. And so far, the results have been terrific. Candace and Ann decided that they would rather come down frequently to Charleston, South Carolina with Michael and Annie Midhofer, where we're conducting the study. And then once this study is over, then we're going to bring MDMA research to Toronto, and they may do a study blending MDMA with cognitive processing therapy. And they're hoping to submit a grant for further research with blending MDMA with cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy. This petition to the Canadian Minister of Health would be terrific, so I just wanted to reinforce that. So we've been in a terrific situation with FDA. Another reason why I think that Trump and Sessions can't stop us is because the FDA and the Department of Health and Human Services has so strongly come out behind us with the MDMA PTSD research moving to phase 3. So in July 28th, we received an agreement letter after 6 months of negotiation from the FDA in this what's called special protocol assessment process. And this means that if we do the studies using these designs, that the FDA will approve the drug. The only condition is that we don't discover new safety issues, which we don't think we will, because tens of millions of people have done MDMA over decades and decades, and we pretty much understand the safety profile. So this was crucial that we get this agreement letter from the special protocol assessment process in writing. We're also incredibly fortunate. August 16th, the FDA granted us breakthrough therapy designation for MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD. This is the most important program that the FDA has, and it's the most promising drugs, and it gives an awful lot of credibility, and the FDA will be working with us to expedite the review, to start negotiating now about all the things we need to do about commercialization. We still have to prove safety and efficacy in phase 3, but based on the phase 2 data that I just shared with you, FDA considers this to be in the group of the most promising drugs that they're working with, and they are now committed to helping us make them into a medicine and to doing the research as best we can. I didn't know that the FDA would do this because it's such a public, prominent statement, but they were willing to do it. So this gives me confidence that the FDA is really science over politics. The new commissioner appointed by Trump says, the pathway for breakthrough drugs has had a really positive impact on the ability of patients with unmet needs to get safe and effective therapies in a timely way. So the fact that they were willing to give us breakthrough is really fantastic. Plus, we've had a lot of media. We're doing a lot of public education. And we've organized these ones from political spectrum, so from left to right. And we've left some off, like the Washington Post. But I want to point out the bottom right-hand corner, which is Breitbart. And we've had a tremendously positive article about MDMA for PTSD in Breitbart. And Michael has been interviewed extensively on Fox News. We have all of these military.com, Army Times, Stars and Stripes, Red Stripe. So we're really building bipartisan support for what we're doing. This is the phase 3 design. On the left, you see screen and enroll subjects. They get randomized. Everybody gets 3 prep sessions, and everybody gets these 3 day-long experimental sessions. One group will be inactive placebo. The first session will be 80 milligrams, followed optionally by 40. And then in the second and third sessions, they have the option to have a discussion with the therapist and the patient whether to stay that same strength or go stronger. And then they can discuss that again between the second and the third session. And then there's a 2-month follow-up. There's these 9 integrative therapy sessions, 3 after each experimental session. Each of these are 90 minutes. And this is the basic therapy protocol. And these are the places all over the world, well, not all over the world, really just Israel, Canada, and the US, where we're going to be having phase 3 sites. And we're starting to negotiate with the European Medicines Agency about working in Europe as well. And that'll take us probably 6 months to a year to finish negotiations with the European Medicines Agency. We got sites in Prague, in Amsterdam, in Utrecht, in Berlin, and in Bristol, and hopefully in Cardiff as well. Once it's approved, though, this is the negotiations that then happen. It's called REMS, Risk Evaluation and Mitigation Strategies. And this is going to be a negotiation about how these drugs are going to be controlled as prescription medicines post-approval. And we're proposing, and we believe it's important, that they're only prescribed by certified therapists that we have trained. Not every doctor will be able to prescribe this. Only people that we have trained. And then in this male-female team, one of them can be a therapist. One of them must be a therapist, but the other could be a student learning to be a therapist, a nurse, a social worker. It'll only be administered in certified clinics, meaning it's never a take-home drug, and there's certain kind of safety screenings that need to take place. We'll still be excluding people with schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, major psychosis, but this is how it'll start, and then it'll expand, and we want to make sure there's no backlash. Once it's marketed, we're also trying to pilot and demonstrate a new way to market drugs. And one of the concerns that people have been expressing about the legalization of marijuana, and I think this is a big issue in Canada, particularly since Canada is going to be moving forward to legalize marijuana, is you got for-profit companies and they're interested in maximizing profits. And the concern is they'll be like big alcohol and big tobacco and market to kids and all of that and market to heavy users. So MAPS has created a public benefit corporation where instead of marketing to maximize profits, you maximize public benefit. And so we can take more social concerns into account. But the only owner of the benefit corporation is the nonprofit. So this is the entire cycle is no private gain, all for public benefit. And we hope to show that this is a new way to market drugs. And maybe the whole healthcare system and pharmaceutical industry should be reorganized as public benefit corporations. There'll be clinics like this all over the place. We anticipate thousands and thousands and thousands of these clinics. There's now about 6,000 hospice centers just in America. We anticipate there'll eventually be that many psychedelic clinics, not all of them in such beautiful locations. But if you want to find them, you'll go to Google Maps and you'll find out where all they are. And this is just a little vision of the future. One day, when I was 18, I decided that I wanted to become a psychedelic therapist. And of course, I needed psychedelic therapy and I wanted to bring back the whole field. And the successful conclusion will be when I get my own license to be a psychedelic therapist. And I'll be the partner that doesn't have a license because I've got my PhD in public policy, but going back to school for a license in therapy, I don't think I'll do it, but I'll find a female therapist that has a license who's willing to work with me. And hopefully on 4/20/2021, I'll get my license. We also, as planning for a post-prohibition world, we do psychedelic harm reduction through our Zendo project at prominent festivals all over the world. We're trying to just show a model that as we move towards medicalization, and as medicalization changes people's attitudes towards legalization, people will start to worry, what is a post-prohibition world look like? Will people have these experiences and be unsupported, have panic reactions? And so by providing compassionate care and psychedelic support services at festivals and in general in the public, we will be able to start showing that a post-prohibition world where people can access psychedelics on their own without medicine, without religion, some fraction of people will get into trouble, but we'll be able to support them through it. So it's not going to be such a fearful outcome, and there'll be way more benefits than risks. The main principles: create a safe space. If somebody's having a difficult trip, this would be something useful for the psychedelic societies to do this at different events, and just to be aware. These are very similar to the principles of psychedelic psychotherapy. So safe space, sitting, not guiding, means that the guide is the person's unconscious. We don't know where they need to go. We don't know the order. Their unconscious will find the way. We talk through, not talk down, which means that we help people address their problems. This is not taking people away. We're not trying to say, don't worry about what you're feeling. Don't worry about your fears and anxieties. We don't say anything like that. We just say, go through it. And then also, difficult is not the same as bad. And we've just had this incredible psychedelic science conference in April, the world's largest ever, 3,000 people. People came from all these different countries. And what I think you can do now, and this is about where I'm about to end, is that these global psychedelic dinners, and we have information on the MAPS website about it. It's the gay rights movement succeeded in large part. They still got a long way to go, but they've succeeded by people coming out. And we need that same thing to happen with psychedelics, sort of a big psychedelic coming out. So these global psychedelic dinners can help people to tell their stories, and you can also use them as fundraisers, either for MAPS or for your own psychedelic societies. And just check out psychedelicdinners.org. And we're thinking of doing a lot of these all over the world in April, which is going to be the 75th anniversary of the discovery of the psychedelic properties of LSD, when Albert Hofmann did the first major experiment, planned intentional experiment on April 19th, 1943. So with that in mind, we're celebrating 75 years of LSD. We're celebrating all of the psychedelic societies. And I'm delighted to open it up to questions.
Hello, Rick. Thanks for the talk.
Yeah.
It was very inspiring. I'm speaking as somebody who has had some training. I did my bachelor in psychology, but I happened to, I guess, run into the wrong professors and really got the cold shoulder. And hearing what's going on with this kind of therapy is really inspiring, because it's, well, I won't go into that, you guys. But I was just wondering what somebody like me, like what my next steps would be to become a part of this.
Well, I mean, there's so many different ways to get to become a part of it, but I think that it will be very difficult in the future for, professors, academics to say that this is not an important area, or that this isn't something that they want to help students with. So I think people need to decide in which way do they want to be involved. If you want to be involved as a therapist, then obviously trying to go and get training as a therapist, but try to pick sites where psychedelic research is going on. We're going to have NYU in New York, UCSF, at Ryerson University in Toronto. We're now starting to negotiate with McGill in Montreal about whether they'll affiliate with our Montreal site or whether that'll be independent. There's Yale is doing psychedelic research. It's happening all over the place. And so I think trying to become a therapist and going to places where therapy is already taking place with psychedelics would be good. But there's also neuroscience. If you're interested in neuroscience research of how psychedelic works, there's studies going on at a lot of universities, at Rockefeller University in New York, elsewhere, and then even businesses, people that are interested in running psychedelic clinics. But I think for now, getting involved is this: how do we change and build on this changing cultural consciousness about the value of these drugs? So 50 years ago, it was more about the fear, and now it's a little bit shifting to about the hope. And we've also seen that a lot of those fears that culture had 50 years ago have not been realized. So I would say many different ways for you to find opportunities to get involved. And if one professor or school doesn't help, then try to go somewhere else.
I'm curious how we can help protect ourselves from malevolent parts of our government using this knowledge that we're finding against us.
Well, can you say more about what do you mean about using it against? Yes.
Well, I mean, they've been using. Okay, we have to go back and forth on this. I'm sorry. I mean, they've been testing and using our knowledge, hypnotherapy in the masses for quite some time. So, I mean, if we're opening this Pandora's box, I think it would be naive of us to think that they're not going to somehow try to use this in furthering keeping us subdued, or yes, with a set agenda against us, or I don't know.
Well, I think, critical thinking. We need to learn how to differentiate between science-based, honest education or propaganda-based education. And that's really a lot about what liberal arts education is about, is how to really do critical thinking and try to differentiate. And I think always bring it back to, what do you know to be true yourself? I think these technologies that we develop can be very freeing for people. And so I think experimenting with yourselves, experimenting to explore your own fears, the ways in which we are able to be manipulated, the way people can manipulate us with fear of the other, with hatred of the other, with jealousies and different ways that we have to, mostly just through working on ourselves. I don't think that there's going to be a time where people are going to be, people meaning government is going to try to aerosolize. They tried to aerosolize LSD, as a non-lethal incapacitator to use it as a weapon of war. I doubt that'll ever happen. It didn't work. But I really think that there's a lot of forces that I think want positive change and want individuals to be empowered. And so I think we just have to be wary of, the information that we're consuming, evaluate it critically. But I don't know that there's going to be any kind of clear way that people can use these technologies of healing against us, against our will. So I guess I just think through learning as much as you can and going to the original sources and questioning everything that you're hearing, including from me and from advocates, that's going to be the best way to protect yourself.
We have a question now from DC.
Hi, Rick. I want to say thank you for this amazing talk. Can you guys hear us?
We can hear you. We're getting a pretty psychedelic view of you. Okay.
Okay. So our question is, are you aware of any research being done on, or any potential work being done on, examining psychedelics on the adolescent brain?
That's a great question. So what's amazing to me is that as part of our negotiations with FDA about the special protocol assessment to make MDMA into a medicine for PTSD, the FDA is requiring us to study adolescents with trauma. So it's not an option. So when you hear about the drug war, a lot of things are like, we have to protect the developing adolescent brain, and therefore we should criminalize drugs and everybody should stay away from them as an adolescent. Based on, fears, the FDA is requiring us to work with adolescents with trauma. So as of the kind of research that's being done now, I know that the National Institute on Drug Abuse is spending $300 million, $30 million a year for 10 years. I think we're starting the either the first year or the second year, and they're going to do brain scans on around 10,000. I think it's like 9 or 10-year-olds. And then they're going to repeat this every year for 10 years. And it's sort of a naturalistic experiment. They're going to look at those people that then say they've used marijuana, or they've used MDMA, or they've used other drugs, and they're going to try to see if there's any differences in their brains and other people's brains. But it's fundamentally a potentially very biased study, because brain changes are not the same as bad. Brain changes can be good or bad. We believe people's brains are changing after MDMA therapy, and their fear-based circuits in the amygdala are deactivated. So this is like a last-ditch effort on the basis of NIDA to try to develop evidence to block legalization, particularly of marijuana. And so I worry that they're going to try to say that if there are any differences, that's automatically a problem. But I think that it's very difficult to do administration studies of psychedelics to adolescents. We have a lower age limit of 18 in our PTSD studies. There was a terrible situation of a young woman girl really, who'd been raped, and she was mute, and her mother wanted her to be in our study. She was only 16, and we applied to the FDA to admit her in the study, and we were told at the time, no, we had to finish in adults before we could work in adolescents. So I'm not aware of any active administration studies, but there are these other attempts, particularly this big NIDA $300 million project to study drugs in the adolescent brain. But I'm very much looking forward to our study with adolescents with PTSD.
Dallas, are you there?
Have you or MAPS implemented any type of a combination of other types of technologies or virtual reality or anything in your type of therapeutic MDMA sessions?
We have not. And the reason that we haven't is because from a scientific point of view, we need to have one intervention at a time. So if we were to combine MDMA with virtual reality or with meditation or something, then the question is, what is the active ingredient? Is it the meditation or virtual reality? Is it the MDMA? But I will share with you, there's a woman named Edna Foa who has developed prolonged exposure. And she's in her 70s now, sort of old school, and she thinks MDMA is pretty much the same as LSD. In 2009, we were in a conference on PTSD in Jerusalem, and she was very scared about MDMA. And then she said, why don't you just use virtual reality? And there was a fellow, Skip Rizzo, who is funded by the military to develop virtual reality for treatment of PTSD. And so she said I should go talk to him. So I went to talk to him, and I said, Edna is scared of MDMA. She wants me to talk to you about what virtual reality can do for PTSD. And he just started laughing, and he said, if you have MDMA, you don't need virtual reality. So I think that not only are we not combining it with other things for scientific reasons, but I don't think that any of these combinations would improve the outcomes. Because with MDMA, it really is about the inner healer, the inner wisdom, people emerging with their material and whatever their ways that they are uniquely going to be doing, and adding kind of programmed other techniques. On the other hand, I just want to say that we are willing to blend MDMA, and we're paying to blend MDMA into this cognitive behavioral therapy, prolonged exposure. So there are other combinations of therapies with MDMA that we're exploring, but that's mainly to educate other researchers, and maybe they'll develop combinations that are even better than our approach. And if so, that'll be great. But we have the feeling that these combinations don't work quite as well as just the method we've developed.
Ottawa, are you there?
So given the fact that humanity is obviously going through a tough time right now, as we tend to throughout our history. And given the awesome potential that psychedelics have in maybe helping us out, should proponents of psychedelics be more vocal in advocating for their use or legalization?
Yes.
All right.
It's hard for me to figure out how I could be more vocal. I did a 2-hour interview with the producer for Megyn Kelly. She's considering doing a show on NBC. There's a book, Acid Test, which some of you may have read about our work with MDMA. The book has been optioned for a movie, for a Hollywood movie, which will be kind of a fictionalized version of it. That'll educate a lot of people. And then we had a meeting with the people who are writing the screenplay for the movie, the Hollywood movie, with a group of people that want to do a documentary about that book too. But, I think in general, people don't have to have the media platform or movies. You can talk to your parents, talk to your friends. So I think, yes, we really need to come out of this closet and be willing to expose ourselves. For those of us that have had experiences that have been beneficial, I think that's the key towards social change.
Okay, thank you. Atlanta, would you like to ask a question?
We're kind of amalgamating a question right now among us all. We wanted to hear your vision for what the psychedelic clinics will be like, and how people are going to get certified to be clinicians in these clinics, and just flesh out that vision for us a little bit more.
Okay, that's great. So the basic thought is that psychedelic clinics are going to be places, not just like here's an MDMA clinic, here's a psilocybin clinic, but the people will be trained in using multiple different drugs at different times, sometimes eventually even in combination. So people will be able to go to a clinic and you can get ketamine depression or psilocybin for a mystical experience, or MDMA for any range of different things. And the training, and this is going to be something we believe the FDA is going to require, is that the sponsors, so MAPS will sponsor their work with MDMA. There's a group called USONA that's going to be sponsoring the research in the US with psilocybin, that the sponsors are going to be required to train the people. The clinics will be operated initially with patients, but we've already shown in our study with the researchers in Toronto with the cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy that has both people receiving MDMA, the patient and the significant other. So these clinics will start with just the patients. They'll expand to family members who are all affected by what's going on with the designated patient. Eventually, I think the clinics are going to be sites of initiation. So I think we will treat psychedelic drugs like driver's licenses or pilot's licenses, where you have to demonstrate proficiency before you can fly on your own. So I think the clinics will be a place where, through all the taxes that are being paid by people buying these drugs, either as medicines or as post-prohibition world, so somebody would go to a clinic and would have a very inexpensive, virtually free, or potentially even free session with therapists. And if they handled it well, then they get a license and they can then buy it on their own and use it in any context. So the clinics are going to start with patients, expand to families, and then become sites of initiation and be part of how we really move towards a post-prohibition world where people have the freedom to explore on their own in whatever context they want. And these clinics some will be run by MAPS, some will be run by other companies. There can be chains of clinics. I think that this is the real way that we're going to demonstrate as we roll this out into society that we can do so in a safe way through the clinic model.
Calgary, do you have a question?
Hi, yeah. So I'd heard of MAPS going back years and years, maybe 6 years, and it wasn't until a music festival that actually had a teleconference that I really got a dose of what you guys do. But it wasn't until a year later that we went to a psychedelic supper, and something really struck me, which was how important it was for individuals to come out about their psychedelic use. And you've mentioned that in a few of your talks, how important it is for people to come out about their use. And I would imagine help others come out about their use. Do you have any advice on how to actually do that as an individual?
Yeah, we've had several of the people that were in our studies decide to talk to the media and come out, but we had several of them. It turned into a much more complicated emotional issue for them because some of them had been abused by family members, or so now when they come out about it, then the world sort of knows about it. So and we've counseled them. I think the most important thing is come out with your family first. And if you can do that, then you've got sort of a base of support. So as you come out in more and more public context, if there's people that are uncomfortable with what you're doing, or they want to try to, give negative feedback, at least you've got a base of support. And I think some people are also concerned about their workplace and what happens if there's drug testing at your work and you acknowledge that you've committed a crime to use these drugs. And so I think everybody has to find for themselves where are they vulnerable, and to do what you can to make yourselves less vulnerable, but also realize that not speaking out makes us vulnerable too. That's what keeps the drug war going. So I think it's important to do, but really try to understand what the risks are in your own individual case, and work first off in the most sensitive. And if you say that, like your family, that's the hardest, and well, maybe that's the most important work, is just take a year or two with your family before you go out even further if they would see you negatively. So I think it's really important. The other thing I think that's crucial is to not exaggerate the benefits and not minimize the risks and minimize the downside. We saw that with the Good Friday experiment, which was about in 1962, about whether psychedelics could produce mystical experiences. I did a 25-year follow-up to that. And what I found is that a lot of the people I interviewed said that they did have these mystical experiences, but they also struggled a lot, and that they were fearful that they were going crazy at moments, or they were terrified of letting go. And most of the discussions about that study were more about the benefits. So I think when you start trying to come out to people, it's very important not to just gloss over the hard parts. And, it's inevitable. This whole exploration with psychedelics, this inner exploration of our own psyches, some of the people in our PTSD study says, I don't know why they call this ecstasy, because they're struggling. So I really think giving a balanced perspective and not to undo it. And I think the other point is to not say, psychedelics are the only way that that people can learn this. For me, there's a lot of things I've only learned through psychedelics, but people can learn these in other ways. The psychedelics open doors to consciousness, and there are other doors. So there's an arrogance to say, I've done psychedelics, I know the truth, I've got it, and if you haven't done it, then, how could you possibly understand? So just be balanced and somewhat courageous as you share your stories.
Portland, do you have a question?
Relative to the grandmother, sacred plant ayahuasca or yahe, what do you think is MAP's position, responsibility, policy around the indigenous peoples who have kept these traditions alive, and also the environmental print that we leave when we go to the Amazon?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think that, and Dennis, I'm sure we'll talk more about that as well. But I think that we have to acknowledge where these drugs came from as they entered more Western consciousness, and do whatever we can to protect the environment where they're produced, to avoid over-harvesting, and also to protect the indigenous cultures where they came from. And we have a lot to learn from them. But at the same time, I believe that these are gifts to humanity from the plant world, you could say, and that it's not culturally disrespectful, I don't believe, to take ayahuasca and try to use it in different cultural contexts, some with a religious shamanistic overtone, some with a scientific overtone context, and that's a delicate discussion, but I do believe that, there's a study that's been done in Brazil with ayahuasca for depression, but they're giving ayahuasca with a few minutes of kind of ceremonies, but then it's all in a scientific context in a hospital setting. And so what we're trying to do is try to figure out how we can get a standardized supply of ayahuasca accepted by the FDA and by regulatory agencies so we can start making it into a medicine as well. So I think that the religious context, the shamanistic context that has been the sort of creation of ayahuasca, now it's being spread throughout the world. And we do have the Santo Daime and the União de Vegetal legal in the U.S., but I believe that it's appropriate and respectful to acknowledge where it came from, but also move towards trying to integrate it into Western science and Western psychotherapy. But doing that, like, for example, we supported a study in British Columbia that was a Peruvian shaman coming up to work with First Nations peoples that had problems with addiction, with Gabor Mate as the psychiatrist mediating the study. And we got really good results, and Gabor was talking a lot about it in the media, and Health Canada said to him that if he continued to talk about it, they would take away his license, and that this was practicing medicine without having done the proper research. And then, but they said we would be willing to let the research happen. I found a donor willing to pay for freeze-dried encapsulated ayahuasca, which is being researched for several decades now in Spain, in Barcelona with Jordi Riba. And the Peruvian shamans refused to work with this freeze-dried encapsulated ayahuasca because it wasn't in the traditional form. So I think there's a lot of negotiations between the indigenous people who develop these things and how we try to bring forward the therapeutic context, the therapeutic potentials into a more Western context. And at the same time, what we need to do is bring the research back and try to use that to protect the indigenous culture's use.
Montreal, do you have a question?
So it seems that about 2/3 of the people who are doing MDMA-assisted psychotherapy are getting really wonderful results. And my question is about the other group of people that are not getting those benefits. If you can say something about what your thoughts are about why these people are not responding. And just a question I have, just speculation that is previous SSRI use for some of these people a factor in why they're not responding?
Yeah, okay, so first off, the statistics I showed you with 2/3 no longer having PTSD at the year follow-up or more. The other third, many of them have benefited. They just haven't benefited to the extent that they no longer have a diagnosis of PTSD. And part of it, the key thing I think we found is that we have a scale that we use for dissociation, sort of, and those people that score high on dissociation, and that's often a primary strategy when people are being traumatized. They sort of move out of their body and dissociate as a survival mechanism, that the stronger that dissociation is, the more work it takes to help them process the trauma. And so some of those people that we, in this 1/3 that still have PTSD, if they had a 4th or a 5th session and were treated over a longer period of time, we think a lot of them could also be healed. But we also do require people to taper off their SSRIs in order to move into the therapy. And that can take a longer period of time or shorter, depending on which SSRI. And we've done a little bit of an informal post hoc study, and it looks like those people that have tapered off longer from their SSRIs do better. So we're now trying to have more time tapering off the SSRIs, and that they end up, if you administer MDMA when people are using SSRIs, it mutes the effect of it. So I think dissociation is the main thing that we've been able to find. Not depression. People have high levels of depression, but they can be, and that's correlated with PTSD, but it's more this dissociation. And I think SSRIs serve to suppress symptoms and mute the effect of MDMA, and the longer people are off them, the better. But that said, no treatment works for everybody. And that's why we're supporting all the available methods. And we're just saying MDMA should be one of the other available methods, because some people, for example, for marijuana, I mean, some people don't want to do the painful work of confronting your trauma and working through it. I mean, people sometimes are shaking for hours as their body is releasing the trauma that they experienced initially. And so there may be people that just want to smoke marijuana and not have nightmares and be focused on the present. And that's a perfectly legitimate option. I think people should have the choice and the option to use a variety of treatment methods. And healing 2/3 of the people who are chronic treatment resistant, severe to extreme PTSD, no longer having PTSD, that's pretty great. But we do need to learn more about the non-responders. It's important that you pointed your finger at that. I appreciate that.
Philadelphia, do you have a question?
Yeah, I have a question about the MDA-assisted psychotherapy.
Yeah.
I was curious about how more respected and accredited therapists, do you think that they would be more deterred for participating in these experiments based on their association, with their name being associated with these experiments or with these studies?
Well, I think that we're finding that more and more of the mainstream PTSD researchers are getting involved with this because of the results. And there's not much stigma anymore because there's a general dissatisfaction with the currently available treatments, that they work for a bunch of people, but there's a large number of treatment-resistant people with PTSD that the currently available treatments don't reach. I think the one area that's pretty tricky, to get more to the heart of your question, is that we believe that those therapists that want to work with MDMA will be, or with psilocybin or even with ketamine, will be more effective if they've done the drugs themselves. And so, you don't go to a meditation teacher who's never meditated or a yoga teacher who doesn't do yoga. So we went to the FDA about 8 years ago and said, we need a protocol where we can give MDMA to therapists as part of their training. And the FDA helped us figure out how to do it. So now we are bringing therapists from all over the world to either Boulder or Charleston, and we are able to administer MDMA to therapists in a therapeutic setting. We have to give one day MDMA and the other day a placebo with a day in between. And so there are some concerns that some people may not want to try MDMA. We feel, on the one hand, that if therapists are scared of having their own MDMA experiences, how can they be trusted to help other people work through their trauma with MDMA? But we feel that we should not require it. We don't feel that we should require that therapists do the drug, but that we strongly encourage it. And it's because we don't want to create this cult-like, everybody has to do the drug, everybody has to drink the Kool-Aid. But this idea that people have been shying away from, researchers have been shying away from MDMA because of the stigma, that's been true. And that's why it's taken us, 31 years since I started MAPS in '86. But we're seeing a major turnaround in a lot of traditional therapists are now starting to take a look at MDMA because they see it's working, they see it's safe, they see the train is leaving the station, and they don't want to be left behind. So but there will be some that never want to do it or talk down about it without even knowing it. And for those, we just say the results will speak for themselves. And if you want to learn, great. And if not, we have 18,000 people on our website who have wanted to be notified for when we start phase 3 because they've got PTSD and they want to consider being in the studies. And we have also about 1,800 therapists who are waiting to be trained in how to use this in therapy in their practice. And so we're we feel pretty good about, well, and as the last thing, and this is what we'll close, there was an article in the New England Journal of Medicine a couple months ago about all these new promising pharmacological treatments for PTSD. So the New England Journal of Medicine is one of the top, most prominent medical journals in the world. And this article was military people, VA people, researchers at academic universities, and they didn't mention MDMA or marijuana. And that's because of this stigma that you're talking about. But we wrote a letter to the editor in June, Candace Monson from Ryerson in Toronto, and Ilsa Jerome from our staff, and Michael Midhofer, our lead psychiatrist. And we wrote this letter to the editor of New England Journal of Medicine saying, this is a really good article, but you left out MDMA and marijuana, and here's all these references, why that's important. And we just found out on Friday that the New England Journal is accepting that letter for publication. So I think we're gradually overcoming stigma from the field, and this will become, I think, mainstreamed and accepted to the point where by 2030, we think there'll be thousands of clinics, and people will just accept the fact that it's always been like that. And we think by 2035, we'll have moved to a place where these drugs will be legal for anybody. And you'll all hopefully live to see that day, and hopefully so will I.
Thank you, Rick. And I believe you are going to introduce Dennis.
Yes. Well, I was on the phone earlier today with Dr. Charlie Grobe, and Charlie's done some incredible studies with Dennis, the Huasca projects, some of the first studies in Brazil about long-term ayahuasca use. And Charlie just said to say that he's the world's greatest living ethnobotanist for psychedelic plants. And I think that's really true. He's worked on interdisciplinary studies of Amazonian ethnopharmacology and plant psychedelics. He's done work in Peru, Colombia, Brazilian Amazon. He's got his PhD in 1984 at the University of British Columbia on ethnopharmacology of ayahuasca and Okohi. I don't know that drug. That's a new drug. 2 tryptamine-based hallucinogens used by indigenous peoples. He was a founding board member of the Hefter Research Institute, key organizer in the Huasca project that he did with Charlie Grobe that really helped the UDV get approvals and full legality in Brazil. And he's currently assistant professor in the Center for Spirituality and Healing at the University of Minnesota. And I think that I'm very proud to have Dennis as my friend and to be involved in this process of working with Dennis, because I think he's got a really keen understanding of how we can reach out to the mainstream and communicate the incredible power of these substances. And with that said, I'd like to introduce you to Dennis McKenna.
Oh, thanks, Rick. Very nice introduction. I really appreciate that, and for your kind words. I feel similarly very honored and proud to call Rick my friend. You know, I mean, this man is a pioneer. Obvious, I think we all know this. You know, and thank you for sharing your plans for world domination. And it's a beautiful vision. And I hope it goes somewhere. You know, and I mean, not that you are Timothy Leary. I mean, you're much more. You know, you're much better than Timothy Leary. I think Tim was a great guy, but he was in the grip of cultural forces that even he didn't understand. But, you know, you're very visible. You're very out there as an advocate for psychedelics, MDMA in particular. I hope you do not get branded as the most dangerous man in America, as Tim once was, though you may well be. But hopefully, you know, that won't be the main thing. I mean, you're doing fantastic work, and I know that it's been an uphill battle. You know, and many of your colleagues have said, Rick, you'll never do this. Give it up, forget it. You know, but for years and decades, you've just persisted. And now here we are, and you actually you've been a real catalyst, I think, for evolution. Because, you know, as a biologist and a plant biologist, I kind of look at these things as a co-evolutionary process. But there are key factors in that evolution, and you're one of those catalysts for evolution. So it's good, you know, it's good what you're doing, and you know, I think certainly you and I, and probably most people in this seminar, would agree that psychedelics do have the potential to revolutionize medicine and at least psychiatry. And it is in sore need of revolutionizing, because it's a very hidebound, rigid, and often, in some ways, ineffective discipline. I think that psychiatrists have, you know, a compassionate desire to help people, but the way the system is structured, it's often very hard for them to do that. And so thanks, Rick. And I don't know where you are. You look like you're in a very hot, windowless loft someplace. So join the club. I am here. We're having a late season heat wave. I'm up here in my loft, and I'm sweating like a pig, but I've got all the fans going, so hopefully we can get through this. So
I have a home office in my attic, and
right, same thing. I have no air conditioning, and it cracked 90 today. So Minnesota, you know, in the fall, we're just not used to this kind of thing. But it's all right. Here we are. So I'm going to get the plugs out of the way for you know, just give me a minute. So this is what's been preoccupying and consuming my life for the last few months. I organized a conference called the Ethnopharmacologic Search for Psychoactive Drugs 2017. And it was in the UK at a wonderful place called Tyringham Hall. And it was a commemoration in some ways. It was a 50th anniversary symposium of a conference by the same name that was sponsored by the National Institutes of Mental Health, of all things, in 1967 in San Francisco. And at the time, they were going to have follow-up conferences every 10 years. That never happened. The war on drugs came along and so on. So I thought it was high time that we had a follow-up conference, and that's what this is. And in the spirit of that, we're publishing the symposium volume. Let me see. From this, which will have the original 1967 publication, which was all the taxpayers ever got out of it. It was a private conference, and the 2017 edition in a wonderful box set collector's edition. You can order it here. We're taking pre-orders at espd50.com, and that's how we're going to pay for this thing. So enough of the shameless self-promotion. If you want to buy that book or that set of books, I think you'll find it a fine addition to your bookshelf if you're the generation that actually still reads books. I know most of you don't, but anyway. So I'm going to talk today actually not about ayahuasca directly, but in general. I want to talk a little bit, I want to mention at least the Hefter Research Institute. We're sort of the bastard stepchild of MAPS. You know, we never get enough attention, we never get very much attention, but we do work mostly on psilocybin, and many of the researchers in the field belong to our, belong to the Hefter Research Institute. So you can check it out at hefter.org. We are really complementary to what MAPS does, but MAPS does it very well. So just want to bring your attention to that. And then I want to take from the 30,000 foot level, I want to talk about plants and plants chemistry, because many of these psychotropics obviously come from plants. And plants are great chemists, and the reason they are is because they've mastered this process of photosynthesis. And they're able to make an enormous variety of organic molecules from sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide. And in the process of doing that, they do a couple of other things that are quite convenient, for which we should be very grateful. They produce oxygen as a byproduct, which is convenient for us because we happen to breathe it. They also sequester carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and bind it into organic compounds. So living plants, photosynthetic plants, are the main thing that is keeping the oxygen levels in the atmosphere within parameters that are tolerable. But we're destabilizing that because we're burning the rainforest, basically, and other things. We're releasing far more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere than plants are capable of absorbing. So that is a problem. But what do plants do with all this chemistry? They use carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight to make complex organic compounds. Most of these things are universal. They're kind of the molecules of life, if you will. They occur universally in all organisms. The ones in the yellow boxes, though, are called secondary compounds. They don't occur in all organisms. They're widespread, but obviously they're not essential for life, or they would be in all organisms. What do they do with these? It used to be thought that this was just a kind of a chemical noise, and these things really didn't have an application. But it turns out that in some ways, these secondary molecules, such as the alkaloids, the terpenoids, the phenolics, and so on, are really molecular messengers. They are the language of plants, if you want to think of it that way. Plants don't have behavior. They've substituted biosynthesis for behavior. Plants are stuck in one place. They have to deal with their environment through different means. They've chosen chemistry to do that. And they use these messenger molecules to mediate relationships with other organisms in their environment, including other plants, fungi, microorganisms in the soil, insects. The whole pollination factor is all chemically mediated, and relationships with herbivores and humans. We are an herbivore, after all. And they have multiple applications. Sometimes these molecules have the same molecule may have several roles. They can be used for defense, or symbiosis, or semiosis. They can send messages, a signal, or they can be used. It often gets more interesting when the message is symbiosis. Come together, collaborate, cooperate. The old idea of evolution, that it's natural selection and competition, is kind of an archaic model. It turns out that organisms do better when they collaborate and cooperate. That's symbiosis, close collaboration between different species for mutual benefit. We as a species could learn a lot from the rest of the biosphere because we're not very good at symbiosis. We're very good at fighting each other. This is not going to solve anything in the long run. So we can talk about the Gaia hypothesis, this notion, the old Greek idea that the earth is alive, that the earth is our mother, is really found in the most ancient traditions. And the Gaia was a Greek concept for the earth conceived as a feminine nurturing entity. And of course, it's true. Gaia is the cradle of life. Gaia is our mother. On the scientific side, there's a geophysicist named James Lovelock who came up with a scientific version of Gaia. there's nothing woo-woo or new age about this. This is really a geochemical theory, which is now gaining increasing acceptance. He wrote a book in 1979 called Gaia, A New Look at Life on Earth. And in the book, he argues that the biosphere, that is the entire community of life on Earth, actively modulates the global ecosystem to keep planetary conditions within these narrow parameters, these narrow limits that are optimum for life. And life on Earth has managed to do this for about 4 billion years. You know, it's gone through many changes, but we're pretty sure that life has existed continuously on Earth for about 3.8 to 4 billion years. Of course, the first, 3.5 billion years was kind of boring because it was mostly bacteria living in the soil and in the earth. It wasn't boring to the bacteria, but we wouldn't have been too entertained by it. But so Lovelock's idea, he articulated this notion of geophysiology, that the major parts of the biospheric geophysiology, if you will, consist of the atmosphere, the geosphere, the hydrosphere, and the biosphere, this coating of life, of living things that envelops the earth. And just as a body, a living body works through homeostatic feedback loops, these biospheric level systems are similarly regulated by their interactions. And the biosphere regulates these critical parameters, the temperature, salinity, and pH of the oceans. It's now being destabilized. The pH is changing, the temperature is rising. This is producing, giving rise to these mega hurricanes that we're dealing with. The atmospheric composition, particularly with respect to CO2. And again, we have put these homeostatic systems under such strain that we're destabilizing it. And then the surface temperature of the planet. The planetary temperatures have never gone above the boiling point of water or below the freezing point of water, which is remarkable when you think about it. In 3.8 billion years, average temperatures. So something is keeping things stable. And we are busy destabilizing it. And there are 7 billion of us on the planet, so there are enough of us that we can have an impact. And we also manipulate technologies that can have huge impacts on planetary processes, which we've never been able to do before. And so we're faced with an issue where we can manipulate these technologies, but we can't really use them in a wise way. This is part of the challenge that our species is facing. So the Earth as a whole, the biosphere, is a superorganism. It's a collection of organisms that act as a single organism through collaboration and symbiosis. We have many examples of this. Anthills, termite colonies, beehives. These are all superorganisms. We have naked mole rats and coral reefs are all superorganisms. In fact, humans are superorganisms because we have our own microbiome, and we have several microbiomes depending on what part of the body they occur in, and much of the biomass of our body is not genetically us, it's genetically other. It is these microorganisms, beneficial by and large, that colonize our body. So humans are a superorganism as well. All these superorganisms function basically through 3 important processes: symbiosis, the formation of close associations between different organisms; homeostasis, the state of being in balance, the tendency to maintain these constant internal conditions, even though the external environment may fluctuate greatly. For instance, solar output has increased over time. The temperature of Earth has not increased to reflect that. It is now because we're destabilizing those processes. And then feedback. All of these homeostatic systems work through feedback, which is information that informs a system about its internal state, and external conditions. So homeostasis, were it not for feedback, there would be no homeostasis. So plant secondary compounds, this vast chemical variety that you find in these secondary compounds, you can think of them as the neurotransmitters in some ways of the Gaian mind, of the Gaian brain. Plants speak chemistry. That is their language. And they use chemistry in complex signal transduction conversations with everything in the biosphere. In this way, they regulate interactions with every organism in every ecosystem of every size, from local ecosystems the size of a backyard garden, as shown here, to the planet-size neural network that we call the biosphere. So signal transduction and another term called biosemiotics are worth discussing. Homeostasis, this equilibrium at the organismic level and the biospheric level, is manipulated through feedback loops that operate via signal transduction and biosemiotics. When it happens at the organismic level, it's called signal transduction. At the ecosystem level, it's called biosemiotics. Both of these processes involve the transmission of information mediated by chemical messengers, that is, by neurotransmitters, for example, at the organismic level. So signal transduction is one of the most important things that goes on in organisms because it organizes and orchestrates, I should say, the whole process of what it is to be an organism. An organism looks like an object. It's really a process. And about 1/8 of the genome, the human genome, is dedicated to these signal transducing molecules, neurotransmitters, hormones, and similar things like that. And the key point to make about signal transduction is it's a chemical process. It is a molecule coming to a cellular target, usually on the outside of a cell, and having an effect, binding to that target and triggering some other event, usually a cascade of additional biochemical reactions. So signal transduction in a typical cell looks like this. It's a very common, there are many types of receptors on the cell, many types of molecular messengers, all working together in a highly coordinated network system to keep the cell or the whole organism working smoothly. So when we come to the organism level, the neural network level of the brain is essentially a biochemical machine that is specialized for signal transduction via this process of neurotransmission. And all of the brain's critical functions, including our experience of conscious awareness, are mediated by this neuronal communications network. And neurotransmitters are simply small molecules that mediate this crosstalk between neurons. And neurotransmission is the primary signal transduction process by which neurons communicate with each other. And you've all probably seen this diagram. This is a picture of a typical synapse, a serotonin synapse, or it could be another type of neurotransmitter. But there is a process where you have a presynaptic neuron. Nerve signal comes in here, and the neurotransmitter is stored in vesicles in the presynaptic neuron, and that causes them to fuse with the membrane. They are opened up into this synaptic gap, and they cross to the receptive, the so-called postsynaptic neuron, bind to receptors, and then it elicits effects, intracellular effects, which may involve ultimately the propagation of the signal to the next synapse. And then other things happen. The neurotransmitters are taken up, and sometimes taken up by things like those serotonin transporters that are the target of SSRIs and also MDMA to a certain extent. So most psychoactive drugs that we know, whether synthetic or natural, affect this process. the synthesis or the storage or the release, the degradation or the reuptake of neurotransmitters, or often they act like neurotransmitters themselves. They mimic neurotransmitters and bind to these receptors. So that's neurotransmission. And neurotransmission takes place in the brain. And often the plant messenger molecules that mediate these processes were originally signal transduction molecules working in the ecosystem, working on the ecosystem level. So I liked Salvador Dali's response when somebody asked him, how do you think of all these surrealist paintings you make? You must be taking drugs. He said, no, I am drugs. And if you think about that, that's true. We are biochemical engines that run on drugs. And drugs work through signal transduction, homeostasis, and feedback. So we're all made of drugs. I'm sorry, folks. I mean, the Partnership for the Drug-Free America, they may as well give it up because we're all made of drugs. And a lot of the most important neurotransmitters that mediate consciousness are the so-called biogenic amines. There's basically 3 of them that are most important, and they come from the so-called aromatic amino acids, phenylalanine, tyrosine, and tryptophan. These are universal compounds. They all are components of the 20 amino acids that go in to make proteins, so they're universal. And they happen to be the source of these neurotransmitters. And tryptophan is one of the oldest ones, and it's of particular interest to us because it's the neurotransmitter that spawns many psychedelic compounds through very simple processes. Got tryptophan is decarboxylated to produce tryptamine, and then other enzymes kick in to modify that tryptamine nucleus. You can add 2 methyl groups, and you've got dimethyltryptamine, probably the most structurally simple psychedelic that we know, produced by 2 trivial biochemical steps, 2 enzymes that are everywhere in cellular metabolism. And then you can add a hydroxyl group, say, to the 5 position, and you get something called bufotenine, 5-hydroxydimethyltryptamine. Or if you add a methyl group to that hydroxyl group, then you get 5-methoxy-DMT, another potent psychedelic. Or if you hydroxylate the indole ring at the 4 position, you get psilocin, 4-hydroxy-DMT, which is the active form of psilocybin. Or you can put it through another biochemical trip. You can take that side chain and cycle it around and produce a prototype beta-carbolene, which is interesting because the beta-carbolenes happen to be MAO inhibitors, as you know, and they activate things like DMT, which are not orally active. They permit them, as in ayahuasca, taken together. They allow DMT to become orally active. So tryptamines and DMT and its derivatives are not rare in nature, not rare at all, unlike what we've been led to believe. Here are some of the main sources of dimethyltryptamine and its derivatives. The Varrola snuffs, these are members of the nutmeg family. The sap is very rich in tryptamines. The Anadenanthera snuff, the seeds are very high in bufotenine and DMT. Of course, there are the toads, the hallucinogenic toads, psilocybin mushrooms, and last but not least, the human brain, which makes 5-methoxy-DMT, DMT, and beta-carbolines. It's a veritable ayahuasca pot full of these interesting molecules. And if you look at plants that might contain DMT, it's not just a few, it's tens of thousands of plants. These are families here, these are genera of plants that have been reported to contain DMT. Here's the compounds reported. The numbers in parentheses are most significant probably, because some of these genera are huge. Acacias, for example, 1,200 species of acacia. Probably 75% of acacia species contain DMT or other derivatives. So these are not rare. That's only half the list. Here's a whole bunch more. So, Psychotria is another huge genus, the source of chacruta. There are 1,400 species of Psychotria. So it's not a mistake to say, it's not really an exaggeration to say that nature is drenched in DMT. It's everywhere. Why should this be? I don't know. Maybe it's an accident of evolution. It is certainly partly a result of the fact that DMT is such a simple molecule, just 2 steps from primary metabolism. So this metabolite of tryptophan, DMT, is everywhere, including in us, and it's not orally active. That's the funny part. It's hidden from human experience until you either ingest it as a smoke or a snuff, or you happen to ingest it with a monoamine oxidase inhibitor. Psilocybin is an orally active form of DMT. You don't require any special preparation. So when it comes to the, what was probably the earliest sampled accidentally psychedelic, it was probably mushrooms. Ayahuasca is a very sophisticated pharmaceutical preparation. It was not the first one. And in fact, current thinking is that it's not that old. Ayahuasca is not that old. But what I say is DMT and psilocybin are messenger molecules from Gaia, and they're catalysts for cognitive evolution. They're trying to send a message to us. We are the aliens. Of all species on the planet, we're the ones most estranged from nature. We're the ones that are most separated from nature. This is the problem that we're facing. But built into the architecture of this human nervous system is a set of receptors sensitive to DMT and these other tryptamines that apparently open the doors to an unseen universe that we would never suspect existed until we made that discovery of the world of DMT, the dimensions revealed by DMT. What is the message? I say the message is wake up. The earth is trying to give us a message that we need to wake up and re-understand our relationship to nature as a species, because we are the problematic primates. We're the ones that are threatening the continuing existence of life on Earth most seriously now. And we need a catalyst, apparently, to wake up. In indigenous societies, they have this concept of plant teachers, and I think this is literally true. They experience these plants as teachers. They have wisdom that we can connect with. What do they teach us? Well, biophilia, for one thing. They teach us symbiosis. They teach us an appreciation of this interdependency of living things. They teach biophilia, a love for life. They teach animism. They teach a perception that everything is alive, and in some respects, intelligence. And they speak pantheism, the idea that the universe itself is alive and intelligence. The divinity is not from outside. It's built into the structure of the universe. And these are not suppositions. These are not theories for indigenous people. These are self-evidently, empirically verifiable perceptions of the way reality is. And it's part of the indigenous worldview. And interestingly, it's not that far outside the scientific worldview now, as we're beginning to understand it. So plant teachers teach us new ways of thinking and perceiving and being. They stimulate wonder and awe. They stimulate ideation and creativity and curiosity. The psychedelic experience is usually beautiful, so they stimulate aesthetic sensibilities. Psychedelics open the door to this universe within, a seemingly vast, dark continent populated with strange entities. And they enable the experience of a transcendent aspect of reality, a reality that's apparently not part of this continuum. a reality that may even exist beyond death. So they are mind openers, really, and eye openers. They teach us a different way of thinking. What are the evolutionary consequences of this? We've evolved in this complex chemical ecology over millions of years. What has it done to the evolution of our brain, which, by the way, has tripled in size within 2 billion years, a very short span of evolutionary time? Well, so they've made us curious. They've given us an imagination. They've given us a way to visualize internally models. And as a result, they've created this species that is the best hope and the worst thing that's ever happened to life on Earth. We are inherently dangerous because of our ability to manipulate these technologies. The stately pace of biological evolution no longer applies. The fate of life on Earth is in our hands. We can and do build technologies that can wipe out life on Earth. We know this, we have. We can and we will build technologies that will enable life to escape from Earth, if that's our destiny. We can, and hopefully we will, build technologies that will enable life on Earth to flourish for billions of years. There's no reason why it can't. We can eventually devise technologies that will allow us to escape from Earth, if that is our destiny. But there's no reason why what we leave behind should not be a park and not a toxic waste dump. You know, at least we could do that for our mothers. The problem is what we lack, and what psychedelics are still teaching us, is that we have to develop wisdom. We're extremely clever in our inventiveness, but we're not wise. So psychedelics are trying to get us to wake up and learn wisdom. What does our mother want? What does it want for all of life on Earth? Well, we have to look at life on Earth and what does life do? What does life like to do? It likes to grow. It likes to proliferate. It nourishes and nurtures. That old symbiosis thing. It expands into every conceivable niche. And even though it originated on Earth, there's no reason for it to remain confined on Earth. It seems that eventually it will have to move beyond Earth. And it has this fundamental impulse to colonize new territories. Given the opportunity to expand beyond Earth, there's every reason to think that it would. This may be human destiny. We are curious, we're clever, imaginative, we're psychedelically informed, and we're problematic, but we are life's best chance to escape from this earthly cradle and spread throughout the galaxy. This is our destiny, and it's life's destiny. In fulfilling it, we apply the lessons of 500,000 years, at least, of symbiosis with the plant teachers that have been moving us in this direction all along. And in fulfilling this destiny, we will transform all of life on Earth and ourselves most of all. We may be human now, but once we leave the nest, we will become more than human. We will discover what we have always been, which is infinite, unbounded, and immortal. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis.
That's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you. Thank you so much for all the work you've done. You and your brother have really changed not only my life, but the lives of many. So I just want to say that. I know we don't have much time, but thanks again. So
well, thank you. It's very kind of you to say that.
The question is, what sort of future dream experiments are you hoping to see in the future? Of course, with experimentation opening up and even thinking much, much further down the line, what sort of experiments, not even necessarily medical, would you be hoping to see done, whether it be with DMT, psilocybin, or any other psychedelic?
Well, I think, I think the I think the frontiers are really many. There are many frontiers. There are many facets to this, and right now the focus seems to be on medical applications. Because and that's good. That is the way that psychedelics can become legitimate and respected. But I think it goes way beyond that. I think once that's accepted, I think that psychedelics are basically, in a larger context, they're tools for understanding consciousness. They're tools for understanding the mind. And once a context has been created regulatorily where people can experiment with them, not necessarily because they're sick, because they're mentally ill, but because they want to understand consciousness, then I think you're going to see some very interesting applications of psychedelics. For example, in problem solving, and this is already being investigated. I can imagine Rick is talking about centers where one could go and take psychedelics. And that's, it's thought of in the context of treatment for PTSD or whatever. But maybe at some of these centers you could get, I think it would be fantastic to get, say a group of mathematicians together in one of these conferences and have them take the appropriate psychedelic and see what comes out of that, or physicists or chemists or, not to neglect the humanities either. Poets and writers and all this. These are cognitive tools. These are tools for learning essentially how to put our minds through its paces. They are mind expanding after all. So I think the frontiers are vast, and I think the more we can study these things, the better we'll understand each other and ourselves and each other. That's my hope for psychedelics, and with something like ayahuasca, which of course there are issues with our impact of the global culture on these indigenous cultures, but really ayahuasca is the common heritage of humanity, and we have to respect the indigenous people, but we have to respectfully say, we also, that any person on the planet has a right or should have a right to a relationship with ayahuasca, because I think it's one of the catalysts that's really teaching us about our relationship to nature. But that said, we have to be sure that it's sustainable, that we have to respect the indigenous cultures, and at the same time, learn how to use these medicines in a way that might not be so traditional, but might actually also be, a legitimate way to do it. So even though we've been working with psychedelics for really, depending on when you want to start counting, hundreds of thousands of years ago, but we're still learning how to use them. We're still learning the best ways to use them. So they have taught us all along. They're still teaching us, and I look forward to what we can learn from them.
Thank you. Baltimore, do you have a question?
Yes, we do. Hello, thank you.
Hi.
My question was what your thoughts were on psychedelic drugs and their relationship in the advancement or studies of mental telepathy or telekinesis.
Well, yes. I think they have great promise there. I think that, they haven't been studied, right, in that way, not so much, except maybe in the context of shamanism. And in shamanism, these things go on, telekinesis, telepathy, these things do occur, but they don't really, these are hardly controlled situations, I think you might be able to use psychedelics to study these types of psi or paranormal phenomena. It's kind of surprising to me that there haven't been more structured approaches to this. But then when you think about it, both areas are stigmatized, right? I mean, psychedelics are stigmatized, paranormal phenomena are stigmatized. If you tell somebody who's not in the bubble that, you're a researcher using psychedelics to study paranormal phenomena, they're going to call them men with nets, right? I mean, they will assume that you're a complete nut job, even though you're not, but it's difficult. It's politically difficult. But again, this is something, the threshold that can be crossed once people have access to psychedelics and they become more legitimized. Then you can begin to use them to investigate these things without necessarily being marginalized and condemned and vilified and all the things that I mean, anybody who pushes the frontier on any level, it doesn't have to be about drugs. Look what the church did to Galileo. I mean, he invented an instrument that let people see aspects of the solar system that they really didn't want to see, and so he was condemned for that. But it I mean, and this is what we're up against. I mean, there is a certain, probably more people who have an attitude that, my mind is made up, don't confuse me with facts. Then there are people who say, well, we really don't know as much, very much, and so let's explore these. Let's explore consciousness. And if psychedelics are a way to do that, then why not? We should use all tools that we have. Because what do we have except consciousness? There is no other thing, and if we don't learn how to use these brains better, then we're in deep trouble, I think. We've got to learn that. So that's my, as usual, long-winded answer to your very simple question.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Do you have a question? Oh, Rick, please feel free to comment.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that there's one of the early Facebook people that has enormous resources that said he only wants to fund research that nobody else is funding. And so I've been asking him to fund our MDMA PTSD research, and he said no, because other people are funding that. I'll introduce you to some people that will help you raise the money, but I want to fund something that nobody else will fund. And it turns out that he's interested in psi phenomena and psychedelics. So we have a funder once we can come up with a protocol, and we've just been so busy negotiating with the FDA to try to figure out about phase 3, and we've been too busy to think about it. And I said to him, there's the difference between healing and knowledge, and I would rather have you spend money on healing instead of this just knowledge about psychedelics and psi. But he said no. He's interested in funding that. And then I said extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof, and that this could be very expensive as part of my sort of fundraising strategy. And he said that's fine. So I think, Dennis, at some point when, in a couple months when we're a little bit further along and ready to think about that, if you wanted to work on coming up with a protocol for psychedelic and psi phenomena, I think we have a funder.
Well, yes, that's interesting. First of all, send me his email, right? Number one, send me his email. Number two, I would like to reference the experiment at La Churrera, that's sort of my cred, even though it's the least credible of the stuff I've done. But I gave a talk, the talk I just gave was one of the talks I gave at Breaking Convention. But the other one was called The Experiment at La Chirera. The title was Experiment at La Chirera, Psychotic Dissociation, Shamanic Initiation, or Alien Encounter. And I argued for alien encounter in this talk, and just to cause trouble, right, and to stir things up, and it was a riff off of something that Terrence said many years ago, which some of you may have heard. He said, we are involved in a symbiotic relationship with something that has disguised itself as an alien invasion so as not to alarm us. And I think there's some truth to that, so I think that there's great potential for to use psychedelics for investigating the paranormal. If it's interesting. I have had a chance to spend some time with Whitley Strieber over the last year, and some of you may know he's identified with the idea of alien abduction. And he's the alien abduction guy in the Greys. He wrote the book Communion back in the 80s, which was a bestseller. Very interesting guy. Absolutely terrified of psychedelics, even though he's been surrounded by the most bizarre events all his life. I mean, things that, I told him, you're either blessed or cursed, Whitley. I have to take drugs to get anywhere close to the stuff that happens to you every day. So, and he understood that. But it can be approached.
Yeah,
I think it can be approached.
I have an account from Stan Groff from 1970 when he was with Walter Pankey, and they did an experiment with LSD and ESP. And this was at Johns Hopkins, and Stan was wired up to EEG and all sorts of biological measures. And Stan started talking about how he started getting a bunch of them right, these remote viewing experiments. So I'd love to send it to people if they're interested. I don't know if I could maybe send it to one person, you could forward it to the rest or something. If you can send me an email, maybe Bradley or something, if you could send me an email, I can send it to you. And you could say, it's a very interesting account, 1970, about Stan's own personal report about this psychedelic LSD ESP experiment. And it's one of the lost threads of the early psychedelic research that has not yet been picked up again.
And was it a controlled experiment, Rick, where they had somebody, Stan was on the LSD and then doing this, and then they had the control, and they showed that it was a higher success rate or hit rate?
It's not persuasive from all of this distance, but they had him reading cards in a different room that he couldn't see. And he got three right in a row, and he was convinced that he knew about it, and that's pretty amazing. And then he said, this is just a parlor trick. I'm going to go on to deeper spiritual stuff. And, from all these years later, from 47 years later, I wish he would have done it 10 times in a row. That 3 in a row is not persuasive, even though he was getting it right. So it was
right.
Not a controlled experiment, but it's interesting to read his account. And it's, one of those things that probably would have continued if the backlash hadn't shut down the research.
Yeah, well, the backlash shut down a lot of things. Yeah. I wanted to actually, in this context, I wanted to show you one of the people that might be an investigator here is David Luke, our friend from the UK, who's written a book called Other Worlds, Psychedelics and what he's calling exceptional human experience. I don't know if you can see that very well. I haven't read it yet. It looks absolutely fascinating. And it is basically about this, about psychedelics and the paranormal and people who have had, paranormal experiences related to on psychedelics or otherwise related to psychedelics. So he might be a good investigator, although, after he's published this book, he's probably lost all credibility. But, it looks like a very interesting book, actually. So people are thinking about this, and you may have heard, you probably did, I think Strassman and some other people recently published a paper proposing to do to give someone DMT over a prolonged period using an indwelling catheter.
Yeah.
And see how, so that they could stay in this state for, as long as they wished. I mean, I don't think we have to worry. I don't think any IRB is going to go near this, but it's an interesting idea, So, and I've been to a couple of seminars in the UK, more or less private seminars in which the topic is, basically the entities that you encounter on DMT in these places, are those real or not? And how do you demonstrate that they're real? So then we have to unpack that, right? We have to say, well, what do you mean by real? Let's start there. What do you mean by real? And on some level, every experience that if you experience it, it's real. You experienced it, but that doesn't mean it's inside you, outside you. It gets very tricky to think about this stuff. But these are epistemological tools for sort of unpacking the nature of reality. And Terence was always, he would take mushrooms, high doses by himself, and he would get into these dialogues with the mushrooms. And those of you who've taken high doses know that there's very much an I-thou kind of relationship. And he would say, well, tell me something that I can't possibly know. If you tell me something I can't possibly know, then I'll know that you're real. It's not coming from me. But they never did cough up, and they gave lame excuses like, if we do that, then you won't need us anymore. So I don't know. It's tricky, but it could be approached.
Okay, we have a question from Miami. Or Miami, do you have a question? Are you still there, Miami?
Yeah, most definitely. Yeah, hello. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you. Yes, where are you? Oh,
awesome. Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, thanks. Dennis, I wanted to ask on what's your opinion, or if you have had any experience with the use of psychedelics in psychosis or individuals with bipolar, since I see it excluded a lot from the psychedelic uses and whatnot. So I wanted to hear your take on that.
Okay, so I'm not hearing you so good. What is? Could you speak up a little and repeat the question?
Yeah. So pretty much psychedelics and psychotic disorders and bipolar. You get that?
Yes.
Cool. Awesome. Yeah, just your take on that.
I get that you're bipolar, and that psychedelic experiences are psychotic experiences.
No, like for individuals that have problematic psychotic experiences or they're suffering from some sort of bipolar, how can psychedelics benefit this, individuals? Yeah.
Wow.
Question.
Well, I think we have to be careful. The first thing, caution is the better part of valor, but I think that, we have to realize that these diagnostic criteria, these diagnostic categories they're just labels, really, but they don't actually always adequately describe. Every person is an individual, right? And I have spoken with people that would be considered bipolar. They've taken psychedelics. They feel like they've benefited greatly. I've talked with people who have been diagnosed as schizophrenics, who feel that psychedelics have been very very beneficial for them. But most people, I mean, even advocates of psychedelic therapy would say, well, wow, I mean, I'm not going to give psychedelics to schizophrenics, or certainly a braver person than I would. But I think, I mean, maybe Rick can also speak to this. I think there have been some studies recently with MDMA and autistics with social anxiety disorder with quite a lot of positive results. You're getting to the heart of some very difficult to treat, very intractable conditions. PTSD and depression, it's difficult enough, but psychosis, schizophrenia, autism, I don't know if psychedelics have a role there. Rick, what is your thought on that?
I need to be okay. Well, we have completed a study with autistic adults with social anxiety. That was with Charlie Grove and Alicia Danforth, and we got really good results. But autistic is not the same as mentally ill. Holland, who's a psychiatrist that's written some really good books, Ecstasy, A Complete Guide, and The Pot Story, and about her work as a psychiatric doctor at Bellevue, Weekends at Bellevue. She went to medical school because she wanted to do research with MDMA and schizophrenia. And so we currently do exclude people with psychosis, with schizophrenia, with bipolar from our studies. But that's not because it can't be helpful, but it's because people need more support than they get from being in a study where they're, they come for treatment, they spend the night, and then they go home. For people that are have more serious mental illness, they need a more longer and safer container, and it has to be done, I think, on a patient. But we do feel that for schizophrenia, MDMA might be very, very helpful, but it really will take a while before we'll get to exploring that. I'm not so sure about bipolar. There's some discussions about ayahuasca being helpful for some people with bipolar. But these are definitely more challenging kind of treatments, and we need more support. And so it'll be a while before we start looking into that. And, we do know a lot of times stories at Burning Man and elsewhere, people that do have these serious mental illnesses are on medications. They stop taking their medications at Burning Man and then take psychedelics. And then we see a lot of them are very disoriented and confused and, suffering a lot. So it's not automatically immediately apparent that it would be helpful. But I would, of all of them, I would think maybe MDMA for schizophrenia is definitely worth exploring.
Yeah, I think that's, in some ways, that's the next generation of psychedelic therapy. Once we've learned how to use these things in a therapeutic context for things that, where we know there is a clear clinical response, like PTSD, then in the next phase, very capable psychotherapists can work very carefully with people on these kinds of more serious mental disorders. I'm also interested and fascinated by reports I have heard about MDMA and LSD actually that have helped people with chronic stuttering.
Yeah.
That have been therapeutic, and also one person I encountered who had severe dyslexia, who swore that LSD cured his dyslexia. So these are not areas where we automatically, look, and but that's very interesting. I mean, a cure for dyslexia.
Yeah, Paul Stamets talks about how psilocybin helped cure his stuttering. And if you just go on the internet, Paul Stamets, psilocybin stuttering, he's got a great report about his telling that story.
Right, and he's not alone. Other people have too. So that's an area that we really should be exploring. And then I mean, there's so many things. I mean, Chuck Nichols' work on the anti-inflammatory properties of some of these DOI and some of these phenylisopropylamines, at very low doses, much below the psychoactive doses, but it may modulate like chronic inflammatory states. And, there's a lot to be discovered there as well. So, the future is very bright. The pity is that, all this work could go forward so much more if one could apply for government funding for it. And the government, the position is still, we don't care if it makes you rise from the dead. We're never going to fund psychedelic research. That is basically their position.
Yeah, although they're going more and more to not yet. So some of them are
not yet.
Are moving a little bit away from never, but it still hasn't.
Well, that's good. That's good. Well, it's going to take some change in personnel at the top in NIDA and NIMH and these places. Possibly a change in administration. I mean, most likely a change of administration. But yeah, so it's an evolutionary process. I mean, you should never say never. There's possibilities.
I'm going to jump in here. I'm afraid the university is kicking us out, and we have to say good night. But thank you very much to Rick Doblin and Dennis McKenna. And thank you all for joining in this really interesting broadcast. And
okay. Thank you all for the tolerance and patience to listen. Appreciate being invited. So you're the whole thing is over. You're getting kicked out. You're the central anchor for this event, right? If you're leaving, we're all leaving.
I'm afraid so. Yeah, we're all going down.
Okay.
Together.
All right. Very good.
Okay.
Yeah, very good.
Next month, April, or what is it? October 30th, we have Robin Carhart Harris live from Toronto, and
fantastic.
Great. Thank you very much.
All right.
Goodbye from Toronto.
Okay. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.